Well, I'm sure you've noticed there's been a huge fiscal shock for cities during the pandemic. Many cities are simply not able to fund themselves. You've seen the implications of this in smaller municipalities. They can't afford to pay their Eskom bills and they get cut off. Their residents are left without power. The entire council starts to not be able to operate at all because there's simply not enough revenue. Well, let's speak to someone who understands how all of this is working. Danga Mughogho is the program manager for well-governed cities at the South African Cities Network. Danga, good afternoon to you. I mean, even before the pandemic, many councils around the country did not have enough revenue to sustain themselves. I would imagine even the bigger metros now are feeling the financial pinch.
Yes, it is. That's correct, Stephen, and thank you for having me and allowing me to speak to this issue. It is, in fact, correct. As we all know, our country was in sort of macroeconomically was in difficult situation, which of course has a direct impact on the big cities themselves. The South African Cities Network, which we have been doing the research for, which I work for. I'm the program manager for well-governed cities there, and we've just released our State of City Finances report today. The State of City Finances 2020 suggests that the impact of the macroeconomic situation on the big cities, and once again, this is speaking to the largest cities, the metropolitan municipalities in South Africa, has in fact been quite strong. And then you add that to that, the coronavirus crisis, which impacted us, has been with us for about a year or so. So that has had an effect on, as you imagine, with the lockdown. So businesses, which are a primary source of revenue for cities because they charge those businesses for the electricity and the water that's supplied to them, as well as residents who have been consuming less as they've stayed at home and not been consuming as much electricity and water as perhaps they would have in the past because of their straitened financial circumstances. And that has combined to reduce the revenue that cities would have expected to collect from both businesses and residential customers over time. At the same time, they've also faced increasing expenditures. As you can imagine, we all live with masks, and cities have had to support for expenditures around personal protective equipment for their employees. They've had to sanitize public transportation facilities, as well as the costs of maintaining a workforce that is primarily locked down over the last few months has had an effect on city expenditures as well. So revenues have gone down, expenditure has gone up, and needless to say, that's had an effect on city finances.
I suppose the way that you see this, you look for sort of symptoms in the budget, and I'm not someone who goes through a balance sheet in an afternoon, thank goodness, but I would imagine you start to see it in the investment budget. So, as you say, the council needs money to pay salaries, so it takes the money from investing in infrastructure and roads and water pipes and electrical cables and spends it on salaries, which means the roads and pipes and electrical cables start to fall apart.
That is partly true, yes, and indeed it places an additional challenge. One of the things that infrastructure, as we call it, is the fancy term for, as you say, roads and pipes and electrical cables, is that they require ongoing maintenance, number one, over the course of their lifespan, but also we need to build new infrastructure as cities, as we know, increase as people move into cities in search of work and so on. And so one of the biggest impacts of the lockdown, indeed, has been, in fact, on this capital expenditure. So without workforces being able to go out and engage and to do the work that would be required to both maintain and build on infrastructure, but also from the point of view of capital investment. And so typically there's a spending on capital increases over the course of the municipal financial year. And so that would have been towards the end or towards the middle of last year. And that was precisely the time when we were locked down. So that has had an impact, and we'll probably see a knock-on effect when we see audited figures in the year and a half or so to come.
If we keep going on like this, I mean, what happens? Now, it's unfortunate that it's the big metros that consume not just all the services and money, but they also consume all of the media attention. So I imagine one of the things we might see is a big metro not being able to pay its water bill. In fact, I think Mughogho, I speak under correction, but Mughogho may once have already been in that position.
Yes, and I think this is one thing that we do perhaps need to broach, which is that certain of our metros have had challenges around governance. You mentioned Mangaung, but I think that's a very particular case and with very particular circumstances. I think it's fair to say that across the remainder of the metros, that doomsday scenario that you present, I think, would not necessarily happen. I think, and Nelson Mandela Bay, I also should mention around this issue of water. But it also highlights the importance, I think, of the link between the state of governance in a metro, and then also the financial functions and the services that it's able to provide. As you're pointing out, I mean, it clearly is a very important thing. And when governance is shaky, perhaps, then that has a knock-on effect on the city's ability to deliver services to residents and remain a going concern.
Okay, so you talk about governance issues. We've spoken about those in municipalities, well, for many, many years, Danga. How do we fix it? And I've got to tell you, I'm not going to be the one to go and ask Tito Mboweni for more money.
Yes, indeed. And this is an interesting question, because I mean, I think governance and what we're going to be doing in the next year, in fact, the Cities Network is looking at this question of governance in greater detail, conducting research and producing our every 5 years, I don't know what the correct term for that, State of Cities report. And we're going to be focusing on governance in this particular report. And what I can tell you, some of the initial findings we're making is that I think since the 2016 local government election, is that there clearly were changes in government in terms of the power of the various parties relative to each other in some of the metros. And it's about figuring out, and in many cases that has led to instability in the governing coalitions, but also in the general political landscape within some of our cities, and not just the metros. And so when you have stability, and by stability I mean not necessarily that there isn't, politicking, if you will, but that the people who are engaging with that, they have ways and means of resolving disputes and resolving, for example, the knock-on effect that disagreements at the political level can then have on what we call the political administrative interface, which is the relationship between the politicians, the senior politicians, and the leadership who then run the administrators who then run the municipality. And that's a key interface that we need to examine. And I mean, many political systems go through this. We're a young democracy. Local government has been around since 2000, at least in its current form and demarcation. And so this is clearly, it's a learning process. I mean, look what's happened in the United States, which is what we'd call an established, consolidated democracy, and how quickly it is, in fact, for things to unravel. So democracy and indeed governance is something that we all have to work at a constant, on a constant basis, and this applies to our metros as much as it does to the national and other spheres of government.
Danga, I don't know if this relates or not, and I haven't paid enough attention to it, but I understand there's a plan underway in government to look at sort of districts. I think it's being driven by the Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs Minister, Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, as sort of a review process, if you like, that might actually move things into, I think it's 54, maybe 57 districts. Is there some sort of big reorganization underway, or is that a sort of completely separate process?
Well, I can't speak to that. As you say, it's being driven by the Minister of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs. However, it is clear that this district development model, or the one plan as it's been described in the press and by the presidency, is an attempt to really address some of the shortfalls and perhaps deficits in unified planning across all spheres of government. So although the local government sphere is the coalface of delivery, particularly in the non-designated municipalities, so as I mentioned, the South African Cities Network focuses on the metros, but if you're to look at the other 240 or perhaps 280 municipalities that exist, if I stand corrected, there have been some particular challenges about integrating plans across spheres of government to ensure that planning is integrated, number one, budgeting associated with that planning is also integrated, and really, I think, to buttress in many ways, because I think, to be honest, what we're finding 25 years into local government is that there's some particular challenges around the implementation of some of the more complex we talked about infrastructure projects, for example, things that have to happen at the local sphere. And in some of the smaller municipalities, the initial thinking that went into the demarcation perhaps did not take into account, and it would be hard for it to have been the case, some of the challenges that would have emerged over the years since. And so the DDM, district development model, is an attempt to address that.
I mean, Danga, all of this is, I mean, it sounds simple, but it's hugely controversial. I mean, looked at what happened in Vuwani. People thought it was a sensible idea to merge two municipalities together. Then suddenly, almost it seemed out of nowhere, but of course not out of nowhere, there was a demand for two separate municipalities along linguistic lines. No one outside of that area had predicted that that could happen. Anyone who tries to mess with boundaries that involve, say, Democratic Alliance controlled municipalities and ANC controlled municipalities Everyone knows that's going to end up in court. There's a local government election to come. I mean, all of this is very difficult to do politically, and everyone goes to court at the drop of a hat.
Yes, indeed. All I can say at this point is it is, of course, complex. And once again, to go back to my earlier point, I think there are two things. Number one, I think the system is this fancy political science term is institutionalization is setting in. So the legislation, the regulations, the way the different moving parts within and across spheres of government work and engagement with broader society is working its way through the system. And I think we should give ourselves a bit of a break around that. I think we tend in South Africa to set very, very high standards, of course, for ourselves, which is good, but also then perhaps to be more overly disappointed when things perhaps don't turn out as we had expected. Having said that, also, we do have an integrated urban development framework, which is the South African National Urban Policy, which has been driven and was adopted by Cabinet in 2016. And so this development framework posits a new way of working, and this speaks now to the discontent that you mentioned of the citizenry. But this model calls for greater engagement. I think we've struggled to have engagement within the IDP process, which is the municipal planning process every 5 years that cities go through and engage with citizens, but to have real, genuine community engagement in decisions that affect them. And we call this the all of society approach. And I think combined with cooperative governance, as we're seeing through the district development model, which is intended to strengthen that, the idea is that we have a greater conversation between government and citizens. So governance more broadly, not just governing, which is what the government would do. And through that, then you're able to mediate and to head off perhaps some of the more deleterious effects of ructions, of disputes with decisions that have been made, when in fact there has been buy-in on a decision in advance through a community engagement process, through facilitation with the plans that the municipality has, that then we can perhaps smooth over some of these bumps in the road.
Danga Mughogho, I do appreciate the time. Thank you very much indeed. A very complex area, Program Manager, Well-Governed Cities at the South African Cities Network.